The thing about breaking into a galactic bank fortress is that they are annoyingly good at keeping out the riffraff. Captain Jax Veridian thought himself a particular brand of riffraff, one with style, a sense of humor, and absolutely no regard for personal safety. Jax gazed at the holographic blueprint before him, rubbing his stubbled chin. "It's like they don't want us to steal their money," he mused aloud, the sarcasm dripping from his words like hydraulic fluid from a poorly maintained mech. Beside him, Lena, the crew's tech wizard, snorted. "Yeah, Jax, because putting a fortress in the middle of nowhere with the most advanced security known to sentient life is just asking for trouble," she said, rolling her eyes like a pro. The rest of the crew gathered around the flickering display. Cass, the muscle with a heart as cold as the vacuum of space. Nix, the pilot who had a knack for flying through asteroids like they were Sunday traffic. And Thorn, the strategist who had once outmaneuvered a fleet of intergalactic marshals using nothing but a burned-out cruiser and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Together, they were a motley band with questionable hygiene and even more questionable ethics. "So, remind me why we're doing this again," Nix asked, lounging back in her chair with her boots on the table, smearing dirt over the blueprints Jax had painstakingly laid out. "We're not exactly known for our altruism. Because we need the credits and I've got a hunch," Jax replied, flashing a smile that was more mischief than mirth. "Word on the cosmic street is that the Quorum are guarding this place." Thorn let out a low whistle. "The Quorum, those creepy logic munchers. They've got brains like computers and hearts like calculators." "Exactly," Jax said, his eyes glinting with something dangerously close to optimism. "But get this, their weakness is human paradoxes." "Human what now?" Cass asked, looking like she'd rather punch a paradox than ponder one. "Paradoxes," Lena explained, tapping her fingers together like a professor about to blow a student's mind. "Humans are so illogical, so contradictory, that it actually messes with the Quorum's heads. They can't process things like this statement is false or why Jax insists on wearing that ridiculous hat." Jax tipped his hat, a battered relic from a long-forgotten era, and grinned. "It's called style, and thank you for noticing." "Right," Lena continued. "So if we can find a way to weaponize human paradoxes, we might just have a shot at cracking that vault." Cass tapped her foot impatiently. "And what's your plan to turn us into walking paradox bombs, Captain?" Jax leaned back, propping his boots up next to Nix's, much to her annoyance. "Oh, I've got a few ideas. Thorn, how's your headache-inducing philosophy these days?" "Think you can give the Quorum something to chew on?" Thorn smirked. "Philosophy's just a fancy word for annoying people until they want to slap you. So yeah, I've got that covered." "Perfect," Jax said, clapping his hands together. "We'll split up. Thorn and Lena can get to the security system, see if they can fry a few circuits with paradoxical gibberish. Cass, you and Nix are on distraction duty. Let's give them a fireworks show they won't forget." "And you, fearless leader," Nix asked, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "What are you planning to do?" Jax stood, stretching with the exaggerated grace of someone who knew they were being watched. "Me. I'll be the brains behind this operation, skulking around and making sure none of us get atomized." "That's comforting," Cass muttered, cracking her knuckles ominously. The crew set to work, each member bustling with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Jax watched them go, wondering if he was a genius or just suicidally overconfident. Hopefully, he'd live long enough to find out. Hours later, they approached the fortress, nestled on a desolate moon under a sky cluttered with stars that seemed entirely indifferent to the heist about to unfold beneath them. Jax couldn't blame them. He had better things to do than watch someone else's misadventures too. Nix piloted their ship, the irony, toward the surface in a way that made turbulence seem like a gentle massage. "Sure you don't want me to drop you off in pieces?" she called over her shoulder, a malicious grin on her lips. "Appreciate the offer," Jax replied, clutching his seat until his knuckles turned white. "But I think I'll hold out for the full-body experience." The crew disembarked, the crunch of lunar dust underfoot accompanied by the steady hum of their tension. Jax pulled up the scanners on his wrist display, the screen crackling to life with an array of blips and numbers that might as well have been ancient runes. "All right, team," he said, feeling the weight of leadership settle on him like a particularly uncomfortable cloak. "Let's make history, or at least a really interesting footnote." As they crept toward the fortress, its imposing silhouette looming like a dark omen, Jax could almost taste the adrenaline in the air, sharp and electrifying. He gestured for Lena and Thorn to break off, watching them disappear into the shadows with a mix of pride and anxiety. Cass and Nix flanked him, their presence a comforting reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in this madness. "So, you ever wonder if maybe we're the bad guys?" Nix asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Constantly," Jax replied without hesitation. "But then I remember that someone has to be, and it might as well be us." They reached the outer perimeter, a field of defenses bristling with enough weaponry to make a warlord blush. Cass cracked her knuckles again, her grin wicked and ready. "Let's get this party started." "Subtle, remember," Jax reminded her, though he couldn't help but grin back. As Cass and Nix moved into position, Jax turned his attention to the fortress's main entrance. He couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement mixed with a healthy dose of dread. The quorum were logical, yes, but if he'd learned anything in his life of crime, it was that logic didn't always win. And if that wasn't a human paradox, he didn't know what was. The first alarm blared, a sound that was more irritating than alarming. Nix had managed to hack the external sensors, sending the security system into a loop of frustration. "That's your cue," she said through their comm link, and Jax nodded to himself, moving forward with the confidence of a man who had no idea what he was doing but was too stubborn to admit it. Inside, the fortress was a labyrinth of sterile corridors and oppressive lighting, designed to disorient and deter intruders. Jax moved through it like a ghost, relying on Thorn's meticulously crafted maps and his own instincts, which had a nasty habit of leading him into trouble more often than not. "Thorn, Lena, you in?" Jax whispered into his comm, knowing full well that silence could be damning. "We're in," Thorn's voice crackled back. "And boy, do these quorum love their logic puzzles. You'd think they never heard of a good old-fashioned riddle contest." "Remember," Jax said, his grip on his blaster tightening as he turned a corner, "no heroics. Just bake their brains and get the hell out." "Captain," Lena chimed in, her voice full of mischief, "I wouldn't dream of it." The sound of distant explosions filtered through the halls, Cass and Nix's handiwork no doubt. Jax felt a pang of guilt for leaving them with the messy part of the job, but he knew they wouldn't have had it any other way. As he approached the vault, the air seemed to thrum with the weight of what they were about to do. Jax hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat, a moment of doubt flitting through his mind like a passing shadow. But doubt was for people with the luxury of failure, and failure in their line of work often meant a swift and terminal end. "All right," Jax muttered, steeling himself. "Let's show these logical bastards what chaos looks like." He slipped into the vault room, a cavernous space dominated by the imposing presence of the quorum guards. Their eyes flickered with an unsettling glow, their expressions as unreadable as their alien logic. For a moment, Jax considered the odds, the impossible task before him. But then he remembered the thrill of defying those odds, the rush of doing what everyone said couldn't be done. "Hey there, fellas," he called out with a grin, raising his blaster. "Let's see how you handle a little human ingenuity." The quorum turned toward him in eerie unison, and Jax fired his blaster, not at them, but at the ceiling, where the carefully rigged explosive set by Thorn and Lena detonated with a deafening boom. The ceiling caved in, debris raining down as the quorum scrambled to process the illogical chaos unfolding before them. Jax ducked, rolling to the side as the room filled with dust and confusion. "Time to go," Jax yelled into his comm, already sprinting back the way he came, the sound of pursuit hot on his heels. As he ran, heart pounding and adrenaline singing in his veins, he knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. Nix, get the ship ready. We're coming in hot, Jax shouted, leaping over a fallen beam, the path ahead a tangled mess of destruction and opportunity. In the chaos, he couldn't help but laugh, because if this was what it meant to be human, an unpredictable, paradoxical whirlwind of madness, then Jax was damn proud to be one. And by the time this was over, the galaxy would know it too. The air inside the Galactic Bank fortress was thick with irony, and not just because Jax Viridian and his merry band of misfits were relying on paradoxes to outsmart the quorum. As their boots clanked against the sterile floors, the crew couldn't help but feel like they were walking into a digital lion's den, hoping their human nonsense would be the thorn in a lion's paw. Thorn and Lena had already wormed their way into the fortress's security systems like a couple of persistent viruses. Are we sure this place hasn't been sponsored by some non-profit for future dystopias? Lena's voice crackled over the comms, dripping with sarcasm. I'm sure they got a bulk discount on doom and gloom, Thorn replied, fingers flying over the console. Now let's give these logic junkies a taste of human inconsistency. Verified, Jax cut in, trying not to sound too impressed. He was the captain after all. And remember, if they catch on to us, we're toast. Burnt toast. The kind that doesn't even taste good with space jam. Lena snorted. Just like your hat. Touché, Jax grinned. Keep it up. We need them doubting their own circuits. Meanwhile, Cass and Nix were busy playing distraction, the kind of distraction that involved explosive pyrotechnics. Cass had a gleam in her eye that could only mean something was about to go very, very wrong. How do you think they like their paradoxes? Nix asked, as she set another charge, her voice as casual as if she were asking about a neighbor's garden gnome collection. Cooked to a crisp, Cass responded, a wicked smile on her lips. Let's fry their circuits. Jax moved quietly through the fortress, the tension around him tighter than a miser's grip on his last credit. He ducked through a doorway, only to find himself face to face with one of the quorum guards. The guard's eyes flickered like an old neon sign, and Jax could practically hear the hum of its digital brain trying to process him. "Hello there," Jax said, tipping his hat. "I'm just a figment of your imagination, a logical fallacy, if you will." The quorum's eyes narrowed, its head tilting to one side as if trying to compute this unexpected variable. It opened its mouth, and Jax was pretty sure he heard a slight whirring noise like a computer about to crash. "Do you require assistance?" the quorum finally asked, its voice monotone but with a hint of confusion. "Yeah, actually," Jax said with a grin. "Can you tell me why a raven is like a writing desk?" The quorum hesitated, gears turning visibly behind its eyes. Jax didn't wait for it to explode, instead slipping past as another explosion from Cass and Nix lit up the hallway. The quorum's head jerked toward the noise, and Jax was gone, swallowed by the shadows. He made his way to the rendezvous point, heart thudding in his chest like a faulty engine. The paradoxes seemed to be working, but it was only a matter of time before the quorum recalculated their strategies. Back in the control room, Thorn and Lena were knee-deep in logical conundrums. "How's it looking on your end?" Jax asked through the comms, his voice a low murmur. "Like a circus where the clowns have taken over," Lena replied. "We've got them chasing their own tails. Perfect. Just keep them spinning. We're almost done here." Outside, Cass and Nix were enjoying the chaos they'd created. "You know," Nix said, leaning against a wall as another explosion rocked the fortress, "sometimes I wonder if we're making the universe a better place." Cass laughed, a sound that was half amusement, half madness. "We're the best bad influence this galaxy's ever seen." They set one last charge, a particularly nasty one, and Cass couldn't resist a parting shot. "I always did think bank vaults looked better with a little air conditioning." The fortress shuddered with the impact, a wave of destruction that had the quorum scrambling to comprehend this new, chaotic input. Jax sprinted through the collapsing corridors, feeling the tremors underfoot like a countdown to disaster. He skidded into the vault room, where the quorum guards were still trying to wrap their heads around the ceiling that had inconveniently decided to fall in on them. Jax didn't waste time, setting the charges he'd been carrying, a grin playing on his lips. "Let's see how you boys handle a little unpredictability," he muttered, before activating the explosive sequence. He barely had time to dive behind a pillar as the charges went off with a resounding boom. With the smoke clearing, Jax rejoined his crew, who were already making their way back to the extraction point. Their comms were alive with chatter, a blend of exhilaration and disbelief at their own audacity. "You sure you didn't miss your calling as a demolition expert, Cass?" Jax quipped, falling into step beside her. "Maybe in another life," Cass shrugged, her eyes glinting with adrenaline. "But this one suits me just fine." They reached the landing bay where the irony was waiting, its engines purring like a contented predator. Nix was already in the cockpit, prepping for takeoff as the rest of the crew piled in. "Hurry it up," Nix called over her shoulder. "The quorum's about to come out of their existential crisis, and I don't want to be here when they do." The ship roared to life, its acceleration throwing them back in their seats as it shot out of the fortress and into the black void of space. Behind them, the fortress shrank into the distance, a testament to human ingenuity or stupidity, depending on who you asked. Jax leaned back, a satisfied smile on his face as he surveyed his crew. They were battered, bruised, and laughing like maniacs. "Well, that was a riot," Jax said, his voice carrying a hint of pride. "More like a near-death experience," Thorn countered, though the corners of his mouth twitched up in a smirk. "Same difference," Jax grinned. "What's life without a little mortal peril?" Lena shook her head, a wry smile on her lips. "You know, I think we might just be the worst heroes this galaxy's ever seen." "Good thing we're not trying to be heroes," Cass replied, cracking her knuckles. "We're just trying not to be dead." Jax couldn't argue with that. In a galaxy where logic was law and chaos was a crime, they were the unruly exception. And frankly, he wouldn't have it any other way. As they sped away into the vastness of space, Jax knew they'd made their mark. The galaxy might not remember them as heroes, but they'd certainly never forget the day they laughed in the face of logic and lived to tell the tale. And for Jax and his crew, that was more than enough. The air in his cockpit was cramped, a testament to the ship's designer who likely thought claustrophobia was a feature, not a bug. Jax leaned over Nix's shoulder, watching the stars blur past as they left the Galactic Bank fortress in the rearview. It was a satisfying sight, if a little too close for comfort. "How's our tail?" he asked, knowing damn well the answer wouldn't be sunshine and rainbows. "Hotter than a stolen plasma rifle in a pawnshop," Nix replied, flicking switches with a casualness that belied the urgency of their situation. "The quorum's not just sitting back and admiring our handiwork," Jax grimaced. "Of course not. The quorum, despite their penchant for logic, weren't entirely daft." "What's our next move, fearless leader?" Lena chimed in from her corner, fingers still dancing over her tablet like a magician with a deck of cards. Her sarcasm was as thick as the tension in the room. "We keep them guessing," Jax said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Thorn, how are we on paradoxes?" Thorn looked up from his data pad, his face a mask of concentration. "Running low. These logic addicts are adapting faster than a chameleon on a color wheel. We might need to start improvising." "Great," Cass said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Improvisation, otherwise known as everything going to hell but in a way we can laugh about later. That's the spirit." Jax clapped his hands together, more to keep the morale up than because he had any semblance of a plan. "Nix, keep us zigzagging. Lena, see if you can cook up some digital misdirection." "Already on it," Lena replied, typing with the kind of speed that suggested her fingers were about to catch fire. "And Cass," Jax added, a grin forming on his face, "keep those explosives handy. I have a feeling we're going to need them." "Wouldn't leave home without him," Cass said, patting the satchel at her side. Her smile was wolfish, like a predator scenting blood. Outside, the void was deceptively calm, the kind of calm that precedes a storm or, in their case, a high-speed chase involving heavily armed, logic-obsessed lunatics. The quorum was relentless, their ships closing the gap with unnerving precision. "They're learning," Thorne muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. "Predicting our patterns and countering them. Time for a new pattern, then," Jax said, leaning back. He could almost hear the gears turning in his own head, each one rusty with the kind of desperation that only came from being chased by something smarter than you. "How about we hit them with some good old-fashioned illogical nonsense?" Lena suggested, her tone deceptively light. "Mix things up, like a nursery rhyme or something," Nick suggested, her eyes still on the controls. "I mean, who doesn't love a good rhyme under pressure?" "Perfect," Jax said, nodding. "Let's give them a riddle they can't refuse." Thorne sighed, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. "A riddle. That's our master plan. Got any better ideas?" Jax shot back, flashing that reckless grin that always seemed to make people nervous or inspired. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. "Fine," Thorne conceded, tapping away at his console. "How about this? What has keys but can't open locks?" "A piano," Lena said, deadpan. "But also probably the last thing the quorum is expecting." "Exactly," Jax said, feeling a surge of confidence. "And that's the point. Hit them where they least expect." He turned to Nix. "Time to zig when they think we'll zag." "On it," Nix replied, her hands a blur as she manipulated the controls, sending the irony into a wild, unpredictable spiral. The ship groaned in protest, but it held together, streaking through the void like a comet on a caffeine high. Behind them, the quorum ships faltered, their logic circuits struggling to cope with the abrupt shift in tactics. Jax could almost imagine the frustration on their virtual faces, if they had faces to begin with. "Looks like they're having a minor existential crisis," Thorne remarked, a smug smile tugging at his lips. "Serves them right." "Don't get cocky," Cass warned, though her grin suggested she was just as pleased as the rest of them. "They'll bounce back quicker than a rubber ball in zero gravity." Jax knew she was right. The quorum's adaptability was both their greatest strength and their most infuriating weakness. But for now, they'd bought themselves a little breathing room, and that was something. "Let's keep the pressure on," he said, feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Lena, you got anything else up your sleeve?" "Just the usual bag of digital tricks," she replied, her fingers still working like a concert pianist mid-solo. "But I'll see what I can whip up." As Lena schemed, Jax took a moment to survey his crew. They were a ragtag bunch, brilliant, unpredictable, and just the right amount of crazy. The kind of people you wanted by your side when the universe decided to throw its worst at you. "You know," Cass said, leaning back in her seat, "for a plan that basically involves confusing the hell out of a bunch of sentient calculators, we're doing pretty well." "I'll drink to that," Nix agreed, glancing over her shoulder with a wry smile. "Assuming we get out of this in one piece." "Who needs luck when you've got us?" Jax quipped, though he knew damn well that a little luck wouldn't go amiss. The quorum ships were gaining again, their movements more coordinated as they adjusted to the crew's erratic maneuvers. It was only a matter of time before they closed the gap, and Jax could practically feel the heat of their pursuit breathing down his neck. "Time for another distraction," he said, looking at Cass. "Think you can give them a light show?" Cass's grin was all teeth. "Thought you'd never ask." As Cass prepared the explosives, Jax checked the ship systems. They were running hot and the hull integrity warnings were flashing an angry red. Not ideal, but far from catastrophic for now. "Ready when you are," Cass called, her voice crackling over the comms. "Do it," Jax replied, bracing for the blast. A series of explosions erupted behind them like fireworks in the dead of space. The quorum ships wavered, thrown into disarray as they scrambled to recalibrate their sensors. "Nice work," Jax said, his voice laced with satisfaction. "Anytime," Cass replied, her tone breezy despite the tension thrumming through the crew. But their victory was short-lived. The quorum ships quickly regrouped, closing in like a pack of wolves on an injured prey. "They're not giving up," Lena said, her voice grim. "Neither are we," Jax replied, determination hardening his resolve. Nix, plot us a course through the asteroid belt. We'll see how good they are at playing tag in a rock storm. Bold move, Thorn said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Risky as hell, too. Jax nodded, his expression hardening. Better to risk it than let them catch us. Nix spun the ship into a sharp turn, heading for the asteroid belt. A chaotic dance of rock and debris, each piece as deadly as any weapon. Hold on to your hats, Nix warned, her fingers deftly guiding the irony through the tumbling rocks. The asteroid field was a maelstrom of motion, and the irony wove between the obstacles with a grace that belied its patched-together appearance. The quorum ships followed, though their rigid adherence to logic made them less agile in the chaos. Let's hope they have a hard time with this, Lena said, her eyes glued to her screen. As they darted between asteroids, Jax kept one eye on the scanners, watching the quorum ships struggle to maintain their pursuit. It was a small victory, but enough to keep them ahead for now. Keep it tight, Nix, Jax said, feeling the familiar pressure of the chase. Like a duck on a junebug, Nix replied, her focus absolute as she navigated the treacherous terrain. The asteroids loomed large, a chaotic ballet that shifted unpredictably with each passing second. Jax could feel the tension in the air, every member of his crew laser-focused on their survival. "Any more tricks, Lena?" Jax asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Maybe one or two," she replied, a hint of mischief in her tone. "I'll see what I can do." Jax nodded, trusting his crew to pull through as they always had. They were in a tight spot, but they were nothing if not resourceful. "Keep those quorum bastards guessing," Jax said, determination etched into his features. As the asteroid field thinned, the quorum ships began to close in again, relentless in their pursuit. "Looks like they finally caught on," Thorn observed, his tone resigned but not defeated. "Then we'll just have to outsmart them again," Jax replied, a fierce grin spreading across his face. The game was far from over, and Jax knew they had a long way to go before they could call this mission a success. But as long as they kept throwing the quorum off balance, they had a fighting chance. And in a galaxy where logic ruled and chaos was a crime, Jax and his crew were the ultimate outlaws, unpredictable, unstoppable, and unapologetically human. The irony was living up to its name. It was a ship held together by duct tape and desperation, but that didn't stop it from slicing through the asteroid field like a drunk knife juggler on a caffeine bender. Jax Veridian was at the helm, his fingers dancing over the controls as if he was conducting a symphony of chaos. Which, given their current predicament, wasn't far from the truth. Cass was in the back, fiddling with something that looked suspiciously like a bomb and had way too many wires for comfort. "You could at least warn us before we decide to play tag with asteroids," she griped, her tone as sharp as the edge of a broken bottle. Jax grinned, though it was more bravado than confidence. "Where's the fun in that? Besides, consider it team building." "Not the kind of team-building exercise I signed up for," Cass muttered, her hands deftly rearranging the spaghetti mess of wires. Lena was busy tapping away at her console, her eyes darting back and forth like a cat with a particularly interesting laser pointer. "I've got a few more tricks up my sleeve," she announced, though her tone suggested she was making it up as she went along. "Might be able to scramble their sensors, at least temporarily." "Temporarily is all we need," Jax replied, his voice a mix of optimism and "we're screwed anyway" realism. "What's the worst that could happen?" "Don't say that," Nix chimed in from the pilot's seat, her eyes glued to the controls. "You're just asking for it." "She's right," Thorn added, not looking up from his own console. His expression was as serious as a tax audit. "We don't need any more bad luck," Lena snorted, a sound that was half amusement, half derision. "We're riding the cosmic wave of bad luck. Might as well surf it." The quorum ships were regrouping, their logic-driven minds likely churning through every possible calculation to trap them. It was a bit like being chased by a pack of super-intelligent wolves, only less fuzzy and more likely to vaporize you. "Whatever you're doing, Lena, do it fast," Jax urged. his eyes flicking between the approaching ships and the spinning rocks outside. The quorum was learning, adapting faster than they'd like. It was as if every move they made was being tested against 100,000 simulations in a nanosecond. "Working on it," Lena replied, her fingers a blur on the console. "Just need another minute." "Let's hope we've got that long," Nix muttered, her knuckles turning white on the control stick. Jax glanced at Cass, who was still busy with her explosives. "How's the fireworks department?" "Ready to light up the night," she replied with a wicked grin. "Just give the word." Not for the first time, Jax found himself wondering how in the hell he'd ended up with this particular group of misfits. Not that he was complaining. They were good at what they did, even if what they did often involved flouting every conceivable rule of intergalactic law. "All right," Jax said, taking a deep breath. "On my mark, we'll give them a little light show. Lena, scramble their systems. Nix, I need you to pull a maneuver so insane it makes us look like we belong in a lunatic asylum." "Got it," Nix replied, smirking. "One crazy maneuver coming up." "Ready?" Lena confirmed, her voice steady amidst the chaos. "Let's do this," Cass said, her finger hovering over a button that promised a whole lot of noise and hopefully more confusion. Jax took a moment to savor the absurdity of the situation. Here they were, hurtling through space in a barely functional ship, pursued by a bunch of digital psychos with a serious superiority complex. It was almost laughable if you ignored the very real threat of imminent death. "On my mark," Jax said, his voice cutting through the tension like a battle cry. 3, 2, 1. "Mark," Cass slammed her hand down, and the irony shuddered as the explosives detonated in a dazzling display of light and sound. The quorum ships faltered, their sensors overloaded with the sudden influx of data. "Go, Lena," Jax shouted, his heart pounding like a war drum. "Already on it," Lena replied, her fingers flying over the keys. Scrambling their systems now. Jax could almost hear the confused whirring of the quorum's logic circuits as their sensors went haywire. Nix seized the moment, yanking the controls hard to the left and sending the irony into a gut-wrenching spiral. The ship groaned, metal protesting against the abuse, but it held together. The quorum ships, caught off guard, hesitated just long enough for the irony to slip through their net. "Direct hit," Thorne announced, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "We've got a few seconds before they recover." "That's all we need," Jax said, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Let's get the hell out of here." The asteroid field fell away behind them, and the void opened up ahead, the dark expanse of space offering a myriad of escape routes, each as dangerous as the last. But danger was the name of the game, and Jax had never been one to back down from a challenge. As the irony surged forward, Jax took stock of his crew. They were tired, strung out on adrenaline and stress, but they were also alive. And in their line of work, that was something. "Nice work, team," he said, allowing himself a moment of genuine pride. "Anyone up for a victory drink when we get back?" "Only if it's the good stuff," Cass replied, her grin as sharp as ever. "You mean the stuff that tastes like rocket fuel?" Nix asked, arching an eyebrow. "Of course," Cass said, not missing a beat. "What else?" Lena chuckled, the sound a balm to the tension that had gripped them. "Let's not count our chickens before they hatch. We've still got to shake these bastards for good." "She's right," Thorne added, though his tone was more relaxed now. "We're not out of the woods yet." "Yeah, well, we never liked the woods much anyway," Jax said, his smile a roguish thing. "Let's see if we can lead them on a merry chase." The quorum ships were recovering, their formation tightening as they resumed their pursuit. Like sharks scenting blood in the water, they were relentless. "All right, folks," Jax said, his voice the steady anchor in the storm. "Let's keep them guessing. Nix, keep us unpredictable. Lena, keep their systems tied in knots. Cass, keep those fireworks ready." "On it," came the chorus of replies, and Jax knew he could count on each of them. The game was afoot, and it was one they intended to win. The quorum might have the brains, but Jax and his crew had something even more unpredictable. The human spirit, flawed and irreverent, chaotic and cunning. As the irony danced through space, a thought struck Jax. It was a crazy, reckless idea, exactly the kind he liked best. Lena, think you can whip up something special, something guaranteed to make their circuits fry? Lena paused, then a slow grin spread across her face. I might have just the thing. Care to share with the class? Cass asked, sounding intrigued. Let's just say it's a little something I like to call the Paradox Special, Lena replied, her eyes gleaming. Sounds delightful, Nix quipped, her tone as dry as a desert. Jax nodded, his own excitement building. All right then, let's give them a taste of human ingenuity. As Lena set to work, the quorum ships closed in once more, relentless as ever. But this time Jax felt an electric thrill of anticipation. They had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one. And in a galaxy ruled by logic and order, a little chaos went a long way. Ready on your mark, Jax, Lena said, her fingers poised over the keys. All right, team, Jax said, his voice a rallying cry. Let's show them what we're made of. The quorum was closing fast, their ship sleek and menacing against the backdrop of space. But as the irony surged forward, Jax felt a surge of confidence. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched, but they were also ready to show the universe what it meant to be truly human. Let's light it up, Jax said, his grin a feral thing. With a final, defiant flourish, the irony burst into action, leaving logic in its wake and chaos in its heart. And for the first time in a long time, Jax felt truly alive. The irony hurtled through the void, a beleaguered metal pigeon trying its damnedest to dodge a hailstorm of quorum laser fire. Jax Veridian shifted in his seat, trying to ignore the ominous creaks and groans of the ship that seemed to say, I'm too old for this shit. He grinned, a lopsided devil-may-care expression that had gotten him into more trouble than it had ever gotten him out of. Lena, Jax called out, glancing over his shoulder, how's that Paradox Special coming along? We could use a little insanity on our side right about now. Lena didn't look up from her console. A mess of wires and circuits sprawled out in front of her like an abstract piece of art. You can't rush brilliance, Jax, she replied, her fingers dancing across the keys. Unlike your piloting, which seems to be a rush to an early grave. Jax chuckled, though it was more of a grim bark. Just keep our electronic saviors on standby. The quorum's breathing down our necks like a bad hangover. Cass, ever the voice of blunt honesty, piped up from her corner of explosives and doom. You mean right up your ass, she muttered, her hands deftly assembling yet another device that looked like it would blow up if you sneezed on it. Details, Jax replied, waving a dismissive hand. He turned his attention back to the viewport, where the stark black of space was interrupted by flashes of blaster fire and the grim shapes of pursuing ships. The quorum was relentless, and if Jax knew anything, it was that logic never tired. Nix, who had somehow become the unofficial voice of caution, called out from the pilot's seat. We're running out of room for your crazy stunts, Jax. The quorum's closing in tighter than a noose at a hanging. Jax nodded, his eyes narrowing. Right then, it's time to make a new plan. We had a plan, Thorne asked, his voice as dry as bone dust. He was the rock in their storm, they just wished he had a better sense of humor. Of course we had a plan, Jax replied, feigning indignation. Step 1, get into trouble. Step 2, make it worse. Step 3, improvise. And Step 4, Cass asked, twirling a detonation wire like it was a toy. Profit, Jax said with a grin, though the humor was lost in the tension. As if on cue, the irony shuddered violently, throwing everyone against their restraints. Red lights flared to life, an all-too-familiar color on their dashboard of doom. That doesn't sound good, Lena said, her tone as flat as old space ale. It's not, Nix confirmed, her hands working furiously over the controls. We just lost sublight engines. We're a sitting duck. Jax swore under his breath, a string of colorful expletives that suggested he was fluent in a dozen galactic dialects. Lena, any chance we can talk to these guys? Maybe offer them a bribe? Lena snorted. You mean the ones currently trying to turn us into cosmic confetti? Sure, I'll just ring them up and suggest a game of intergalactic charades. Great, Jax replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If you need me, I'll be over here, praying to the gods of improbable survival. The quorum ships were closing in, their maneuvers as precise and cold as the vacuum of space. Jax could almost imagine the logical circuits buzzing away, calculating odds and strategies. It was like playing chess against a supercomputer with a penchant for checkmate by incineration. "Lena, now would be a really good time for that trick up your sleeve," Jax urged, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "Almost there," she muttered, her focus unyielding as she executed her final keystrokes. "Just about." "Got it." But before she could unleash her paradoxical havoc, the ship jolted again, a brutal, bone-rattling impact that echoed through the irony like a death knell. "Direct hit," Thorne reported, his voice as steady as ever. "Systems are failing. We're losing control." "And there goes our advantage," Cass muttered, her fingers still resting on the edge of destruction. "Guess logic wins this round." Jax felt a cold knot of dread twist in his gut as reality crashed down like an asteroid. The quorum weren't just winning, they were systematically dismantling their options until there wasn't a shred of hope left. "Brace yourselves," Jax ordered through gritted teeth. "This is gonna hurt." As the quorum ships moved in, Jax's mind raced, searching for a way out, a loophole, a miracle, a last-minute reprieve. But the universe, as it often did, offered nothing but silence. "Jax, we've got incoming," Nyx warned, her voice tight with urgency. Too late. A bright flash enveloped the irony and everything went dark. Jax awoke to a throbbing headache and the kind of disorientation that suggested he'd gone several rounds with a particularly angry asteroid. He blinked, trying to piece together his fragmented memories as the world swam back into focus. The first thing he noticed was the cold. The second was the fact that he was no longer on the irony. "Ah, you're awake," a voice observed, calm, clinical, and entirely devoid of warmth. "I was beginning to think you'd prefer to sleep through your interrogation." Jax groaned, forcing himself upright and taking stock of his surroundings. A stark, metallic room, sterile and featureless, with a single door and a glaring overhead light. It was about as inviting as a funeral at a slaughterhouse. "Interrogation," Jax mumbled, trying to muster some bravado despite the pounding in his skull. "I must be on the guest list of every upscale joint in the galaxy." The owner of the voice stepped into view, a quorum officer, as cold and calculating as the machines he commanded. "Jax Veridian," he said, consulting a datapad with a slight frown. "Leader of the so-called irony crew. Quite the rap sheet you've built up." Jax shrugged, or at least he tried to. It turned into more of a twitch. "I like to think of it as an extensive resume, shows versatility." The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You and your crew are notorious for your disruptive antics, but your luck has run dry." Jax smirked, though it was mostly habit at this point. "Luck's for amateurs. I prefer a good old-fashioned miracle." The officer's lips twitched. A semblance of a smile, perhaps, or just a glitch in his programming. "How about this miracle? Tell me how you bypassed our security and maybe I'll consider not spacing you." Jax leaned back, his forced nonchalance betrayed by the tension in his shoulders. "Let me guess. I spill my guts and you let my crew go free. Sounds like a fairy tale. More like an opportunity," the officer replied, his eyes narrowing. "One you should consider carefully." Jax chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "See, that's the problem with opportunities. They always seem to cost more than they are worth." Meanwhile, back on the irony, the rest of the crew was coming to terms with their current predicament. With Jax captured, a leadership void yawned in the cabin, as uninviting as a black hole. "So who's in charge now?" Cass asked, breaking the silence that had settled like dust after the crash. Thorne looked up from the console, his gaze steady. "Until we get Jax back, we need to work together. Prioritize survival." Lena snorted, though it was more out of frustration than amusement. "Great. So we're basically a headless chicken just flapping around until something eats us." "Not if we have a say in it," Nyx interjected, her tone resolute. "Jax wouldn't leave us to rot and we won't leave him." Cass sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "All right, so what's the plan?" "We can't exactly call customer support for a rescue." Thorn glanced at Lena, who was already back at her console, her fingers moving with determined precision. "First, we need to get the ship operational. Then we find a way to trace the quorum's signal and get Jax back." "And if we can't?" Cass asked, her voice low but steady. Lena paused, meeting Cass's gaze with unwavering resolve. "Then we improvise." "Again," Cass replied, though a ghost of a smile played on her lips. As the crew set to work, each member tackling their tasks with grim determination, the weight of their situation pressed down on them like a suffocating force. But if there was one thing they all knew, it was that despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. Back in captivity, Jax was playing a dangerous game. He knew the stakes. He had gambled with death too many times to count. But this time, the odds felt impossibly stacked against him. The quorum officer watched him with a cold, calculating gaze, as if dissecting him with his eyes. "You seem remarkably calm for a man in your situation." Jax shrugged, trying to project the same insouciance he'd feigned in countless other scrapes. "Calm, more like resigned. You know, playing the villain gets old after a while." "Perhaps," the officer replied, not taking the bait, "but everyone has their limits." "Funny thing about limits," Jax said, leaning forward, his eyes glinting. "You never really know where they are until you've crossed them." "Then consider this your chance to find out," the officer replied, his voice a chilling promise. Jax knew he was on borrowed time. His crew was out there somewhere, scrabbling for a foothold in an impossible situation. They were the only reason he hadn't given up the ghost completely. If there was a way out, they'd find it, or die trying. As the officer made his exit, leaving Jax to his silent contemplation, a grim determination settled over him. He had no illusions about the odds, but if the irony had taught him anything, it was that sometimes, just sometimes, chaos was on his side. And chaos was a hell of an ally. Back on the irony, the crew was slowly knitting their threads of hope together. The ship was a battered mess, but it was still their best shot at getting Jax back. Lena was miraculously coaxing life back into the systems, while Thorn and Cass kept the ship from falling apart with spit and stubbornness. Nix, ever the pragmatist, was plotting their course, or what passed for a course when your navigation system had more holes than a cheese grater. "We find the lead, we get Jax, we burn out of here," she summed up, her voice brooking no argument. "We make it sound so easy," Cass quipped, shaking her head as she checked yet another conduit for viability. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Thorn replied, his focus unwavering. As the crew worked, the specter of Jax's absence hung over them like a shadow. But it was a shadow they were determined to step out from under. They were a ragtag bunch, a mishmash of outlaws and misfits who should never have worked together. But in the face of insurmountable odds, they had become something more, a family of sorts, bound by necessity and grit. "Almost got it," Lena announced, her voice breaking the tense silence. "Just need a little more time." "Time's the one thing we don't have," Nix pointed out, though her attention never wavered from her screens. "Then we'll just have to make do," Cass said, the resolve in her voice echoing the sentiment of them all. The universe was vast and uncaring, a cold expanse that swallowed hope as easily as it did light. But they were determined to prove that even in the darkest reaches, a spark of humanity could burn brightly. And as they fought to reclaim what was theirs, one thing was clear: they would not go quietly into that dark night. Not without a fight, and certainly not without a little chaos of their own. Jax Viridian cracked an eye open, the cold metal floor beneath him a stark reminder that life had taken a turn for the less luxurious. The quorum officer stood there, all polished boots and clinical detachment, like a tax auditor who'd found Jax's account a little too creative. "Enjoying our hospitality?" the officer asked with a smirk as warm as a cryogenic chamber. "Oh, it's a dream," Jax replied, his voice dry as a desert. "Always wanted to know what it felt like to be a sardine." The officer's smirk twitched, probably the closest he ever got to a laugh. "I'd suggest you focus on more productive thoughts. Like how you're going to explain your little paradox trick." Jax leaned back, feigning relaxation, though the tension in his muscles told a different story. Ah, the paradox. You know, it's less a trick and more a lifestyle choice. The officer crossed his arms, a move meant to intimidate. Your snark won't save you, Viridian. We know your crew uses paradoxes to outwit us. The question is how. Jax grinned, though it felt more like baring teeth. Simple. We just think of logic as optional. The officer didn't blink. Optional won't help you here. We're not limited by human inconsistencies. See, that's your problem right there, Jax retorted, eyes alight with mischief despite his predicament. You're logical, predictable. You see a wall, you go around me. I think, why not just dance through it? The officer tilted his head, expression a mix of curiosity and scorn. Dancing won't break you out of here. No, Jax admitted, but it'll make the time pass quicker. The officer's patience was thinner than a sheet of graphene, but Jax had no intention of giving up the one card he had left: unpredictability. They wanted to understand how his crew had beaten them time after time, but Jax wasn't about to hand them the manual. He needed time, to stall, to think, and maybe, just maybe, to conjure that miracle he'd been banking on. Meanwhile, back on the irony, the crew was knee-deep in malfunctioning systems, and a desperation only slightly more pleasant than being spaced. "All right, Lena, give me some good news," Cass demanded, though her tone suggested she expected anything but. Lena's fingers flew over the console, her determination a force of nature. "Good news. The coffee maker's still working." Cass rolled her eyes. "Fantastic. We're doomed, but at least we'll be caffeinated." Nix, their unofficial voice of caution, leaned over her screen. "I've got a trace on the quorum signal. It's weak, but it's something." Thorne, ever the steady presence, kept his focus on the task at hand. "If we're going to get Jax, we need more than something. Anybody got a magic wand?" Cass quipped, though a spark of hope flickered in her eyes. Lena shook her head. "Sorry, fresh out of miracles. Best I can do is patch up the ship and get us moving." Cass sighed, though it was more frustration than despair. "Then let's get this rust bucket spaceworthy. We might not get another shot." As the crew threw themselves into the repairs, a sense of determination settled over them. They were outgunned, outmatched, and, judging by the latest system diagnostics, probably out of their minds. But they'd been down this road before. They were the irony crew, after all, and they thrived on the impossible. Back in captivity, Jax was piecing together an idea, a desperate, half-baked idea that might just be crazy enough to work. The quorum relied on logic, flawless and relentless. But there was a flaw in their perfection. They couldn't comprehend the illogical, the chaotic, the beautifully absurd. And that's where Jax and his crew shined. He shifted on the cold floor, his mind racing. Paradoxes weren't just tricks or sleights of hand, they were a philosophy. To beat logic, you had to become the illogical. It was a dance, a chaotic ballet where every step was a gamble, and Jax had always been a gambler. The officer returned, his expression unchanged. "Thought of anything productive, actually," Jax said, sitting up. "I have. You guys ever heard of Schrödinger's cat?" The officer frowned. "A theoretical paradox involving quantum mechanics." And Jax leaned forward, excitement bubbling beneath his surface calm. "Think about it this way. As long as you don't open the box, the cat's both alive and dead. Two outcomes existing simultaneously. It's a paradox." The officer considered this, his interest piqued despite himself. "And how does this help you?" "It doesn't," Jax replied, a rogue gleam in his eyes. "But it's a metaphor, see? As long as you don't know what we're going to do, we're both winning and losing. You can't predict what we'll do next, and that's your weakness." The officer's eyes narrowed, understanding dawning. "You rely on unpredictability," Jax smirked. "Exactly. You're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist until we decide it does. But what's your plan?" The officer pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. "Plan? Oh, I don't have one of those," Jax said, grinning wide. "Just a bunch of bad ideas and a whole lot of hope." The officer turned away, clearly mulling over Jax's words. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Jax knew they were running out of time. He had to keep them guessing, keep the quorum off balance until his crew could pull off the impossible. The irony stuttered to life with a reluctant groan, the engines coughing like an old man with a bad habit. But it was moving, and that was enough. Nyx worked her magic at the controls, guiding their beleaguered ship with a finesse that belied the chaos of their situation. "We've got a lock on the signal. It's faint, but it's there." Cass checked the weapon systems, a grim satisfaction flickering on her face. "Guns are online, though they're not exactly at full power. More like mildly annoying than deadly. Everything helps," Lena said, her focus unyielding. "We just need to get close enough to make a difference." Thorn set his jaw, the quiet determination in his eyes a comfort to them all. "Then let's make it count." The irony surged forward, a battered but unbroken force cutting through the cold expanse of space. They were a ragtag group of misfits, but they were family, bound by shared struggles, shared laughter, and more than a few shared bar tabs. As they closed in on the signal, the stakes became crystal clear. This was no longer just about survival. It was about rescue, about defiance, about proving that even the most unlikely of heroes could change the course of fate. Jax sat in his cell, mind whirring with possibilities. The officer's skepticism was as thick as neutron star matter, but Jax wasn't concerned. He knew his crew was out there, and that was enough. The door slid open, the officer entering with an air of impatience. "Viridian, your time's running out." "Funny thing about time," Jax said, grinning like a man who'd just been dealt a winning hand. "It's always running out, but somehow we're still here. You've never faced a foe like the Quorum before," the officer warned, his tone damn near patronizing. "Nope," Jax agreed, a twinkle in his eye. "But you've never faced a crew like mine either." The officer's gaze hardened. "You're betting everything on them." "I'm betting everything on chaos," Jax corrected, reclining back with infuriating calm. "And on the fact that you can't beat what you can't understand." The officer turned to leave, frustration palpable in the tension of his shoulders. Jax watched him go, a plan forming in the recesses of his mind, a plan that defied logic, common sense, and probably a few laws of physics. But then, they didn't call it the paradox special for nothing. On the irony, Cass glanced at the tangle of wires and circuits that was once a functioning control panel. "Lena, you think this'll hold?" Lena didn't look up, her fingers dancing on the keyboard like a virtuoso. "If it doesn't, we'll go out with a bang." Literally. Cass couldn't help but chuckle, a grim humor in her voice. "You always know how to cheer me up," Nyx interrupted, her voice a beacon in the chaos. "We're in range. Time to make our move. Then let's give them a show they won't forget," Thorn said, his voice steady as ever. The crew exchanged glances, a myriad of emotions passing unspoken between them. Fear, determination, and the kind of reckless hope that had brought them this far. And then they did what they did best. They improvised. The irony darted forward, a blur of movement and desperation. The Quorum ships, sleek and determined, closed in, but the crew was ready. They danced through space, weaving a tapestry of chaos that defied the Quorum's logic at every turn. "Prepare the paradox special," Lena instructed, her voice a lifeline in the storm. Cass grinned, her hands steady on the controls. With pleasure. As the crew executed their plan, they could almost hear Jax's voice in their heads, his irreverent humor, his unshakable faith in their ability to overcome. It was that faith that pushed them forward, that belief in the unpredictable power of chaos. And as they closed in on the Quorum's defenses, ready to unleash their paradoxical weapon, one thing was clear. The irony crew might be outnumbered and outgunned, but they were never outwitted. Not while they had a little chaos on their side. The irony rattled through space, a groaning testament to mankind's stubborn refusal to acknowledge the laws of physics. Inside, the crew clung to their seats, or what passed for them, while Lena tinkered with the paradox special, a device that was as mysterious as it was potentially explosive. "Remind me, Lena," Cass called over the din, "what exactly does that thing do? Besides possibly kill us all." Lena didn't bother looking up, her hands deftly working through a complex dance of wires and circuits. "Think of it like an existential crisis for robots. It introduces a paradox they can't resolve, causing a system meltdown. Kind of like asking a philosopher to define happiness. Cass nodded, satisfied. Good. Let's fry their circuits with the power of nonsense. Nix, from her seat at the helm, added, if it works, we're geniuses. If not, we're just another cautionary tale about poking the universe with a stick. Never let it be said we didn't go out with style. Thorne chimed in as he adjusted the weapons systems, which were as unreliable as a politician's promise. The quorum ships loomed ahead, sleek and deadly, like metal sharks scenting blood in the water. Their logical systems would soon face a conundrum they couldn't calculate their way out of. The crew was ready for anything or nothing. Jax would approve. Back in his cell, Jax leaned against the cold, hard wall, contemplating the odds. An officer entered, the door whispering open like a secret, the man's face as unreadable as a poker pro's. Viridian, you're remarkably calm for someone in your position, the officer said, his voice clipped. Jax smirked. Calm? Oh, I'm a cocktail of panic and bravado, I just hide it well. Besides, your face is calming, like a blank slate. The officer bristled at that, his logic-driven mind fighting to comprehend the jumble of human emotions and sarcasm. Your crew is out there planning something foolish, no doubt foolish. Sure, but it's the foolish who change the world, or at least the ones who make it interesting before the end. The officer ignored the quip, focusing instead on his datapad, as if searching for answers in its electronic glow. Your unpredictability is troublesome, which is why we're going to win, Jax replied, a gleam of mischief in his eye. After all, the best plans are the ones that make no sense until they work. The officer frowned, looking as if someone had just asked him to solve a Sudoku puzzle with missing numbers. Unable to process the illogical, he turned on his heel and left, the door sealing shut with a heavy finality. Jax grinned to himself, confident that somewhere out there, his crew was making the impossible possible. The irony danced through the void, its engine sputtering like a coffee maker on its last brew cycle. Inside, the crew braced for the unpredictable. The paradox special hummed to life, its purpose as enigmatic as Jax's poker face. All right, Lena, Cass said, excitement and terror mingling in her voice. Let's see if we can teach the quorum to appreciate the fine art of chaos. Lena hit a final key, and the paradox special thrummed with power, a bizarre symphony of logic and illogic, order and disorder. Nix checked the readings, grinning at the readings. Looks like we're ready to send these tin cans back to factory settings. The quorum ships, sensing the imminent launch of the paradox special, shifted into defensive formations, their logic engines whirring in overdrive. But this was human territory now, a realm where chaos reigned and logic took a backseat. Thorne, ever the calm operator, guided the irony into position. Let's hope Jax was right about this. Hopes for the unprepared, Thorne, Cass said, arming the ship's meager weapons. We're prepared to hope. A button press from Lena, and the paradox special unleashed its payload, a wave of paradoxical code that washed over the quorum ships. It was the digital equivalent of asking a computer to divide by zero while reciting Shakespeare. The quorum ships faltered, their movements becoming erratic as their logic processors struggled to resolve the unresolvable. Systems blinked in and out, lights flickering like a rave gone wrong. Systemic failures across the board, Lena reported, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Their logic circuits can't handle it. Looks like they've finally met their match, Cass said, gleeful. The fortress, once a symbol of impregnable defense, now stood vulnerable as its systems succumbed to the illogical assault. Alarms blared, but their cries fell on deaf ears, overshadowed by the chaos within. Not bad for a bunch of misfits, Nix remarked, her hands deftly maneuvering the controls to weave through the now aimless debris of their enemies. Misfits with a plan, Thorne corrected, his eyes on the prize. Let's finish this. In his cell, Jax could almost feel the shift. It was as if the universe had taken a breath, ready to exhale a story in which the improbable became reality. The officer returned, flustered, his usual stoicism crumbling in the face of the inexplicable. "Your crew, they've done something. The systems are failing." Jax leaned back, crossing his arms with the air of a gambler watching his opponent realize they'd been played. Sometimes you just have to throw the rules out the airlock and embrace the madness. The officer's face twitched, frustration, confusion, and a touch of admiration. He shook his head, unable to reconcile the illogical events unfolding. "This isn't over yet." "No," Jax agreed, "but it's a damn good start." The fortress's defenses crumbled, leaving the vaults unguarded. It was as if a cosmic door had opened, inviting the Irony crew to step through and claim their prize. The Irony darted through the opening, its crew a blur of focused determination. Inside, the vault was a treasure trove of unimaginable wealth and technology, ripe for the taking. "All right, people," Cass barked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been there, done that, and was ready to do it again. "Let's grab what we came for." Lena and Nyx moved with practiced precision, gathering the spoils while Cass kept an eye on their perimeter. Thorn monitored the systems, his calm presence a beacon amidst the chaos. With the Paradox Special still wreaking havoc, the Quorum's response was sluggish, their once formidable logic reduced to a sputtering mess. "Looks like their brains are still scrambled," Thorn noted, a rare grin breaking through his stoic facade. "Good," Cass said, hauling another load of valuables. "Allows us more time for some good old-fashioned looting." As the crew completed their task, the sense of impending victory hung in the air, sweeter than any prize they could claim. They'd done the improbable, turned the tide against a force that had seemed unbeatable. Nyx glanced around, her eyes taking in the scene with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. "I think this might actually work." Cass grinned, her eyes alight with triumph. "Of course it will. We're the Irony crew. We thrive on the impossible." Lena finished packing the last of the cargo, a satisfied nod confirming their success. Time to leave before they figure out how to reboot their brains. The crew hurried back to the Irony, their hearts pounding with the thrill of the heist. As they boarded their beleaguered vessel, a sense of camaraderie enveloped them, a shared triumph in the face of insurmountable odds. Back in his cell, Jax waited. He knew the crew wouldn't leave him behind, wouldn't abandon their leader in the hands of logic-bound enemies. The door slid open once again, the officer standing there with an air of resignation. "You really think they'll come for you?" Jax rose, confidence radiating from him like heat from a sun. "Oh, I know they will. Because when you bet on chaos, you bet on the one thing that never fails to surprise." The officer's composure cracked, a sigh escaping him. "You're a fool, Viridian." "Maybe," Jax said, stepping forward. "But I'm a fool who knows how to dance with the universe." As if on cue, the sound of blaring alarms echoed through the corridors, followed by the unmistakable hum of the Irony's engines. The crew had arrived, just as Jax had known they would. The officer's face fell, disbelief etched into his features as he realized that his flawless logic had been outmatched by the unpredictable nature of humanity. Jax grinned, walking past the stunned officer. "Consider this a learning experience." The Irony hovered outside, its crew ready to retrieve their captain. Cass, at the helm, watched the scene unfold with satisfaction. "Looks like Jax's faith in us wasn't misplaced." Lena glanced over, her eyes gleaming with victory. "We've got what we came for. Now let's get out of here before they reboot and start asking difficult questions." Thorn nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. "Time to go." Jax emerged from the fortress, a triumphant figure against the backdrop of chaos. He boarded the Irony with a sense of vindication, his faith in his crew and in the power of Paradox unshaken. As the Irony sped away, the battered fortress receded into the distance, a testament to the triumph of unpredictability over logic. The crew settled into their roles, their bond stronger than ever. Jax, at the heart of it all, knew that their adventure wasn't over. Chaos had been their ally, but it was the unyielding spirit of his crew that had truly carried them through. And that spirit, unpredictable and irreverent, was something no logic-bound enemy could ever hope to conquer. Jack strolled onto the irony like he owned the place, which, technically, he did, if you didn't count the bank financing he dodged for the last 5 years. The crew turned to greet him with relieved nods and smirks. "Look who finally decided to join us," Cass said, her tone somewhere between teasing and genuinely relieved. "Couldn't let you all have the fun without me," Jax grinned, surveying the loot they'd piled into every nook and cranny of the ship. "Nice haul." Lena leaned against a crate marked with a quorum seal, which she was already scratching off. "Not bad for a bunch of fools, huh?" "Oh, we're fools all right," Jax replied, glancing out the viewport as the bank fortress disappeared into a speck. "Fools who just pulled off the biggest heist this side of the galaxy." Thorn, who'd been silent in his corner, offered a rare chuckle. "And made a solid argument for why you should never mix logic with a good helping of human stupidity." "Stupidity's our secret weapon," Nix piped up from the cockpit, her fingers dancing across the controls to steady their flight amidst the void. "Confuses the hell out of logic-driven tin cans." "To our stupidity," Cass declared, raising an imaginary glass. "May it always lead us to fortune." Jax joined in the toast with an invisible glass of his own. "And to the power of paradoxes. It's good to remind the universe who's really in charge." The ship hummed along, the engines sounding surprisingly chipper for once. Maybe they were just grateful to still be operational after the chaos of the day. The crew settled into a comfortable silence, the kind born from the shared triumph of having narrowly outwitted certain doom. "So what's next, genius?" Lena asked, eyeing Jax with a mix of respect and skepticism. "Well," Jax said, sinking into the captain's chair like a king on a thrift store throne, "we count our winnings and figure out how to stay off the quorum's most wanted list for a while. Should be easy, right?" "Yeah, as easy as getting a cat to do calculus," Thorn said dryly. Nick smirked, adjusting their trajectory to avoid a cluster of asteroids. "Don't worry, boss, I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. Besides, if they catch us, we just bamboozle them with another paradox." "Like what this statement is false," Cass suggested, her grin wicked. "Exactly," Jax replied, eyes twinkling with mischief. "Or maybe something more personal, like convince a human to do one thing and they'll definitely do the opposite." In the quiet of space, their laughter rang out, a rare reprieve, a moment where the universe didn't seem quite so vast and hostile. It was easy to forget, amidst the camaraderie and stolen fortunes, that their little band of misfits had just rewritten the rules of engagement in a way the galaxy wouldn't soon forget. "Think the quorum learned anything from this?" Lena asked, always curious, always one step ahead in her mind. "Probably that humans are a bigger pain in the ass than they thought," Jax said, a touch of pride in his voice. "And that underestimating us is a mistake they won't make twice." Cass leaned back in her chair, arms behind her head, looking as relaxed as a cat in a sunny spot. "We'll be legends, you know, the ones who outsmarted the invincible." "Yeah, or the idiots who got really lucky," Thorn added, ever the realist. Jax shrugged, feeling the weight of the universe settle into a more bearable load. "Luck, skill, insanity, whatever you want to call it, today it got us through. Tomorrow, who knows?" Lena grinned, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Maybe we'll retire, buy a nice little planet somewhere, start a farm." Cass snorted. "Can you imagine us farming? I'd give us a week before we accidentally invent corn that rips a hole in space-time." "And then sells it to the highest bidder," Nix added. "We're not exactly the quiet life types." "True," Jax said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "The galaxy would miss us too much. Plus, who'd keep the quorum on their toes?" Their laughter subsided into comfortable silence, the kind you only get when you're with family. Not the kind you're born into, but the kind you choose. It was in moments like these that Jax knew they had something far more valuable than any pile of credits or fancy tech. And somewhere in the recesses of space, far away from the prying eyes of their adversaries, the galaxy's order shifted ever so slightly. Because that's what humanity did best: stir the pot and see what delicious chaos bubbled up to the surface. "All right," Jax said, clapping his hands and standing up. Time to divvy up the loot and figure out our next move before the quorum decides to reboot their sense of humor. Lena raised an eyebrow. You mean the sense of humor they don't have? Exactly that one, Jax replied, walking over to the pile of liberated goods. Let's make sure we're ready when they come knocking again. The crew set to work, sorting and cataloging their newfound wealth with the precision of seasoned professionals. They were good at this, not because they'd planned it all along, but because they had an uncanny knack for turning chaos into opportunity. Because in the end, when logic failed and systems crumbled, it was the humans, the unpredictable, irreverent, snarky humans, who kept the universe interesting. As they worked, Jax found himself wondering what new adventures awaited them. The galaxy was a big place, and they had plenty of it left to explore. Plenty of mischief to make and mysteries to unravel. And plenty of chances to remind the universe just why it should never underestimate the power of a well-placed paradox. Maybe they'd inspire others, misfits and rebels who'd take their lead and run with it, turning the galaxy on its head one illogical leap at a time. Maybe they'd prove that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to blow it up and pick through the pieces for something useful. Hey Jax, Cass called, holding up a curious-looking device she'd found amidst the loot. What's this doohickey supposed to be? Jax glanced over, eyeing the contraption with interest. No idea, but if it's worth anything, we'll figure it out. If not, we'll sell it to someone who thinks it is. Sounds like our kind of plan, Thorne said, tossing a credit chip in the air and catching it with a deft hand. Always is, Jax replied, watching his crew with a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing they were more than just a team. They were a force unto themselves, a chaotic whirlwind bound together by the promise of adventure and the certainty of the unknown. And as the irony sailed through the stars, leaving the shattered remnants of logic-bound adversaries in its wake, Jax knew they'd continue to be exactly what the galaxy needed, agents of chaos amidst the cold, unfeeling vastness of space. Because at the end of the day, when all was said and done, it wasn't the rules that made the universe tick. It wasn't the rigid predictability of logic or the cold calculations of machines. It was the unexpected, the surprising, the unpredictable nature of humans that made everything worth fighting for. So Jax and his crew leaned into that unpredictability, embracing the chaos as it wrapped around them like a comforting cloak. Because in a universe where logic reigned supreme, it was the fools, the dreamers, and the madmen who held the keys to the future. And the irony crew wouldn't have it any other way.